Every day when I wake up in the morning, I see the sky and I think about the things that you've made, all the beauty and your glory is showing, yeah. It never bores me to look at the ocean. The waves are crashing, the water spraying up in my face. I look above and all the seagulls are soaring, yeah. We've got to overcome the darkness so we don't get caught in the middle, between the hopeful and the heartless. So, hello, good day, good morning, I just can't stop smiling, because today is a brand new day, and all the darkness and the pain is just fading behind me. Oh Lord, what a beautiful day. And all the planets surround me, the way they orbit just boggles my mind, the way the sun keeps on shining, yeah. Got to overcome the darkness so we don't get caught in the middle, between the hopeful and the heartless. So, hello, good day, good morning, I just can't stop smiling, because today is a brand new day, and all the darkness and the pain is just fading behind me. Oh Lord, what a beautiful day. There's nothing to fear, it'll be okay. It's the day that the Lord has made. It's the day that the Lord has made. There's nothing to fear, it'll be okay. It'll be okay. It's the day that the Lord has made. That the Lord has made. It's the day that the Lord has made. That the Lord has made. So, hello, good day, good morning, I just can't stop smiling, because today is a brand new day, and all the darkness and the pain is just fading behind me. Oh Lord, what a beautiful day.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Live with Doug. We are thinking through God's Word together. Good morning, Keith. Hey, Jenny. I said I just listened to yesterday's study. Oh, good. So you're caught up. Well, we're wrapping up this brief series. At least I plan to wrap it up. I suppose if somebody asks a compelling question that we need to spend more time on it, I'll consider that. But we've been looking at head coverings. We looked at 1 Corinthians chapter 11 and what is the expectation there of women as the church gathers. And we looked at 1 Corinthians 14 about women being silent in the gathering. And then we spent some time in Ephesians 5 and 1 Peter 3, looking at wives submitting to their husbands. And along the way, someone asked the question about 1 Corinthians 7. So we're going to take a peek at that. Hola, Grady. This you said fellas. This is not Friday. Fridays with the fellas is tomorrow. This is Thursday. Lunes, martes, miércoles, viernes, right? This is Viernes. Prep for Eternity Homestead, greetings, welcome. Did you hear that I answered, at least I attempted to answer your question, or at least speak to your question yesterday, so I hope that was helpful. It was a good question. Anyway, so we're going to talk about 1 Corinthians 7, and the reason this came up in this discussion was we were talking about authority, and husbands having authority over their wives as the head of their wife. And we looked at Ephesians 5:21, where it says, submit to one another, and how so often today that's taken, husbands are to submit to wives, just as wives are to submit to husbands, and that is not what's being communicated there. It can't be. The words don't allow it, and the context also goes a different way. It's all one-way submission in that text. The church submits to Christ. Wives submit to husbands. Children submit to parents. slaves, submit to masters. It's all one way in Ephesians 5, and 1 Peter says something similar. So that raises the question from 1 Corinthians 7 that talks about authority being mutual. So that's why it was raised, and we're going to take a look at it. So let me read these pertinent verses here, and then we'll discuss it. So Paul says, "Now concerning the things about which you wrote, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. But because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife, and each woman is to have her own husband. The husband must fulfill his duty to his wife, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife does not have authority," there's our word, "over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise also the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Stop depriving one another, except by agreement, for a time, so that you may devote yourselves to prayer and come together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So that's the context here, and you can see why in the conversation about authority, here he says the husband has authority, or the wife has authority over the husband's body, and vice versa. That sounds like mutual submission. Yes, but it's got a context, and that's the thing. So before we dig into the text, let's use this as a great teaching opportunity for how we study the Bible. You've probably heard the little aphorism, "Context is king." We say that pretty frequently, but it is difficult for us to really treat context as king. I don't know if it's just the way we're designed. I don't know if it's just the way our brains work, or if it's a product of now being, we have these devotional books we read, and we spend 15 minutes in the morning, and we have this book that takes one verse, and then you get a couple paragraphs of feel good explanation or something, and we have our little devotional time, and then we go on, and we're taught through that ritual that we could just take verses and ponder those verses as though we know what that one verse means by itself. And we do this in traditional model preaching as well, where so often the most respected preachers so often preach a verse or two at a time, and they approach it from a theological, systematic theology perspective without really showing the context. And that's not how the Bible is written, except for the book of Proverbs, which are intended to be isolated aphorisms. Verses are in contexts, and paragraphs are in context, and chapters, what we call chapters. You realize there were no verses and chapters in the original Bible. They were written, like 1 Corinthians here was written as a long letter, and he's got sustained arguments, and he comes back and repeats things and continues to build his case, and he's writing to address specific things. So all that to say, we can't just grab verses that speak about authority in marriage and build a systematic theology of authority in marriage. We have to let context dictate. Having said that, the context of this discussion about our bodies and authority over our bodies is Paul addressing a question here. So let me go back to verse 1. He says, "Now concerning things about which you wrote." So that tells us right away what Paul is doing. They sent him a letter asking him questions. And this is why I said when we were looking at head coverings last week, we are listening to one side of a phone conversation here. Or to be very accurate and specific, we're reading a letter that is a response to a previous letter, and we don't have the previous letter. So we're having to fill in some gaps and try to figure out what is it exactly that the Corinthians wrote to Paul as we interpret Paul's response. He gives us some information, but there's no doubt a lot more that we don't have. So that's what we're trying to figure out. So then he says this: "It is good for a man not to touch a woman." And here immediately the question is raised, is this a man and a woman or a husband and wife? Well, I would say the context here argues very clearly for a husband and wife. So I think he's saying, is it good for a husband not to touch a wife? Now that seems like a strange statement, a strange question in our day, but it was not a strange question in Paul's day. Good morning, Dale. Glad you could join us. You're tardy. You're a little late. So in Paul's day, in the first century, there was a prevailing view that a wife was to be used sexually for procreation, but not recreation. There was one poet who was also he was a wise man, a well-respected man, and I can't think of his name at the moment. Should have looked this up before we got on. But we have a record of his premarital counseling that he's doing with this young couple. What was his name? If anybody knows, I would please remind me. And he's giving advice to this couple before they get married, and he says to the woman, he says, now, don't be offended or shocked when your husband has all of these liaisons with servant girls and prostitutes and other women. That's just natural. That's what men do. And you, future wife, you do not want to be the instrument of his pleasure. You don't want him to take your body as his tool of pleasure. That's demeaning to a wife. So he's got these desires, these natural desires, and he's going to fulfill those desires through all these other means, but just realize this is how he's designed, and for you, it's actually an honor to you for sexuality with you to be restricted to the goal of making children. That was a premarital advice given, and it was common advice. That was the prevailing view. A man could have sex with any woman he wanted, basically, except a proper citizen wife. But with his own wife, it would be undignified to use her for pleasure. So that, and then you've got just the great licentiousness of the whole context, right? And now these Corinthians, coming out of that into Christianity, are asking questions. Well, what does it mean if we are to not do it that way? Is sex bad? Maybe Paul taught them about sexual purity, and now they're starting to wrestle with all this stuff and deciding maybe sex is bad. Maybe it's good for a husband not to touch his wife because that's the prevailing view. Maybe he's sinning in his own heart, whatever. But something provoked them to ask this question of him. All right, so that's what he's referring to. I think this is a quote, by the way. I think it is good for a husband not to touch his wife. I think he's quoting their letter in response to prevailing view. Paul's response is that is not a good view. Because of immoralities, each man is to have his own wife. You are not permitted to have other women. You can't have the servant girls and prostitutes and such. You have your own wife. In our day, in our wedding vows, if you use the traditional vows, the first one is to have, I take you, right? Take you to be my wife, to have and to hold. Do you realize what you're vowing on your wedding day? It's taken right out of 1 Corinthians 7. To have you, I take you as my wife, to have you sexually, to hold you sexually. Nobody else. I don't get to have anybody else, but I get to have you. Right? That's right out of Scripture here. Each man is to have his own wife, and each wife or woman is to have her own husband. If you weren't a high-ranking, proper Roman citizen, woman, then the expectation was you could be the plaything of other husbands. And Paul says, no. As a woman, you have your husband. You don't have anybody else. Having, meaning having sexually. He goes on. The husband must, and this word must is actually the word obligation. The husband has an obligation. It is a debt. It is an he owes it. Fulfill his duty to his wife. And likewise, also the wife has an obligation. She owes a debt to her husband. See what Paul's doing? He's saying, no, this is what God designed sexuality to be, husband and wife together. And on your wedding day, you took a vow to your spouse. And it's a debt now that you owe your spouse. I just have to interject at this point. We as spouses need to take this for ourselves and look at our own hearts, our own attitudes in this, rather than commanding this to our spouse. I was accused by some, how should we say, some bitter wives who had been seeing therapists who led them down all kinds of ungodly paths, I'll say. And they accused me of telling husbands they can use this verse to browbeat their wives into having sex with them. And what's ironic is every one of those husbands acknowledged just the opposite. The last thing any of us want is to have sex with a spouse who's doing it simply because they have to, because they're told to. Right? I tell husbands, don't use 1 Corinthians 7. If you use this to try to guilt your wife into having sex, it's going to be awful. It's not going to be the kind of fulfilling sex you want. Paul is giving instruction, and pastors and elders and leaders, we need to give instruction here. But for you as an application point, don't apply this to your spouse. That is not going to garner the effect you want. Apply this to yourself. Husbands, are you available to your wife? Wives, are you available to your husbands? You have an obligation. Both of you do. So use this to examine yourself. And frankly, if you are pursuing other ends, like pornography, that kind of thing, you're still failing to keep your vow. You're robbing your wife. He's going to go on to say, I'll show you this. You're robbing your husband. So point is, just don't use this to try to manipulate your spouse. It's not going to get the results you want. But for your own heart, take this seriously and examine if you are one to withhold from your spouse, or if you're not interested, why is that? It may be that you're breaking your vows. So, husband's obligated to fulfill his duty to his wife, and the wife to her husband. And here's the verse that prompted this in light of our series. The wife does not have authority over her own body, but the husband does. And likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. It's mutual in this context. This is not a mutual submission passage, whereas a husband needs to submit and obey his wife and everything. This has a specific context. But the context is, men, be available. Your body sexually belongs to your wife. Now, in our day, I've had guys scratch their head and say, why does Paul even have to write this? What husband doesn't want to have sex with his wife? Why would he have to be told that? Well, number one, you can understand based on the context I gave you, if you're taught by society that your wife is not you're not to be an instrument of pleasure for your wife, because that's not the role of a husband and wife, then you need to be corrected on that. But in our day, again, I would say so many husbands are not available, not interested. Well, let me put it this way. In all my years of pastoring in the traditional model and lots of marriage counseling, I think I had more wives complain to me and my wife that their husband was not interested than I had men complaining about their wives. And I think most of the time it's pornography. So let me say it again, brothers. if you are not interested in sex with your wife because of pornography, lust, those kind of things, you are breaking your vow and you're violating this instruction. Verse 5, stop depriving one another. This word deprive is actually the word defraud. It's used in James. When James there is talking about a landowner who hired workers and then he withholds wages. He's cheating them. He's stealing from them. They've earned those wages. So to withhold those wages is fraud. It's thievery. If you are not if you're not pursuing a good, vibrant sexual relationship with your spouse, you are robbing him or her. So, husband, if you're getting it somewhere else in your own mind, and therefore you're not interested in pursuing your wife, you're robbing from her. You made a vow on your wedding day. And the same thing would be true for a wife. If you're finding every excuse there is and not pursuing it with him, you're robbing him, because on your wedding day, you handed over the deed to your body to your spouse. Said, here, I'm yours. Now, our feminist, marriage-hating culture is trying to destroy this. To even say this out loud. I've been accused of telling men it's okay to rape your wife. That's where we go with this. The haters are trying to destroy this good thing that God has made. And of course, we're all victims. You know, if I don't want something, then I don't have to do it. All that selfish mentality. No. The heart of Christianity is love. The foundational character trait is love. So stop making excuses. You agreed on your wedding day to pursue a vibrant, wonderful sex life with your spouse. To not do that is to defraud them. Repent. And don't listen to the haters and those who are trying to destroy this good thing. So in this context, Paul does say, I have authority over my wife, and my wife has authority over me. But the context is limited here. This does not discount the other things we talked about in the other passages. All right, I see a comment here. We got just a couple minutes if you have any more questions about this. Grady says, yep, neither is to use sex as a tool, weapon, or leverage of extortion or manipulation. Yeah, what a sad thing it is that we have made this beautiful, wonderful gift as one of the major battlefields in marriage. And of course, the enemy is, there's a reason he's gone after this. He knows the urges are strong. He knows how much joy and pleasure we get from it, a good gift from God, and he loves to destroy God's gifts. Grady says, I agree 100%. Porn allows the physical and visual pleasure without the work of being affectionate and loving. Exactly. And men don't realize it. I mean, men will complain, my wife's never in the mood. Well, you have a job to do. You're on the hunt. You've got to do the things that are attractive to her, and it's not doing the dishes. Of course, the world has messed all that up as well. And pursue her. And porn is easier. And the fantasy in our own mind is greater than the real experience. At least we think it is, and we distort the whole thing. All right, so let me wrap up this series. If you're an elder, if you're on this and you're listening as an elder, I implore you, teach on these things, all of them. Head coverings, 1 Corinthians 14, and especially Ephesians 5, 1 Peter 3 on headship and submission. It's the way God designed it. It is vital for a thriving marriage. Don't let the haters convince you otherwise. Egalitarianism does not create a thriving marriage. It's not the way God designed it. It gives a distorted picture of Christ and the church. We are not equal in authority. Jesus does not submit to you. He does not submit to me. And the model that sets up for the family, all of it, and that spreads out to the church, the civilization, the cultures, everything. It's so important. husbands need the backup by elders. There are very few churches, in my experience, where the elders have the back of a husband who tries to take God's word seriously. Let me flip it around the other way. Women are encouraged to refuse submission. Oh, I mean, they'll in a lot of conservative churches, they'll use the term, oh yeah, wives will say freely. But ladies, let me just say this. It's only submission when you don't agree with the decision. Right? Let that settle in for a minute. It's only submission when you don't agree. And when a wife doesn't agree, then suddenly she has this battle raging. She doesn't want to submit. And this turns into conflict, and leaders in the church come to get involved. Most leaders default to the wife. We've been Me Too'd, we've become feminized. Elders are cowards. Now, that's a generalization. There are exceptions, but I've been around some really, really what I thought were solid churches, and at the end of the day, realized how cowardly most men are today when it comes to this. Church leaders. Counselors almost always default to the woman. The man's always the one at fault, and the woman, she's the victim, all that stuff. We have to get this right. Leaders, elders, we have to teach on this, and we have to not assume women are always right. And we have to have the backs of our men when they are trying to obey the scriptures here and exercise authority in their home. Can men abuse us? Of course they can, and they need to be harshly rebuked. But we, in our day, we are so far the other way that there are not very many elders that I know that are willing to call a wife to submission. I mean, let me just say it that way. If you are an elder or your elders in your church, can you imagine them telling a wife, not in general, but in a specific situation, you need to submit to your husband? It's pretty rare. And our families suffer for it because this is how God designed it. So I didn't talk as much about husbands in this because this isn't a series on husbands. But in my marriage book, God's Design for Marriage, I spend a lot of time. In fact, what husbands tell me a lot is, man, you spend such little time on wives and you just beat us up with how much we're to love our wives and cherish our wives and nourish our wives and romance our wives and all this and this. Yes, because husband is the leader and he's held to account. So I'm not giving more emphasis to wives submitting than husbands loving. In this series, I am, because that's been the point. But I do think, by and large, this is missing in our churches, and the church suffers for it. All right. Our time is up. Tomorrow, gentlemen, it's Fridays with the fellas. We're going to continue talking about manhood. And for all of you, we'll be back on Monday in a new series. And I'm not sure what that series is yet. I think I had settled on Hebrews before we started this one. And now go back and revisit that. Again, I'm open to suggestions if you have something on your heart. We'll see. But maybe we'll do Hebrews. I don't know. But have a great Thursday, and I'll see you guys, gentlemen, tomorrow. God bless.